Hello everyone, and welcome back to Royalty Now, where we bring you face-to-face with figures from the past and talk about their history. Today's subject is a woman named Sacagawea, who may be unknown to some of you, but for our American viewers, you know what a cultural force she is. The story of Sacagawea really is the story of the Lewis and Clark expedition. After the United States paid $15 million for a large portion of land called Louisiana, Captain Meriweather Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark, along with 30 other men, were commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson to explore and detail as much of the new territory as possible. Over the next 2.5 years, the men would become the first citizens of the United States to see the Great Plains in their never-ending enormity, to see the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, and to suffer the price of crossing them. Yet through all the miserable cold, hunger, danger, and wonder, they would become the first Americans to reach the Pacific Ocean by land. It would be the greatest adventure of their lives, and it would not be possible without the help of a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea. Today we'll talk about her history, the journey that led her to one day be the face of women's suffrage, and then reveal our recreations of her appearance at the end. So let's go ahead and get started. Sacagawea, which means bird woman, is thought to have been born around May of 1788. In what is now Salmon, Idaho, into the Akaitika tribe of the Northern Shoshone. Since so little is known about her, we're forced to tell her story using the writings of the men who encountered her. Her people and their ancestors had learned to live off the land in one of the harshest environments in North America over the course of thousands of generations. Excavations in the area in 1959 found arrowheads and other tools that dated to 14,500 years ago, ranking them amongst the oldest artifacts on the continent, even predating the Bering Land Bridge. Although we don't have much information on her childhood, we do know that around 1800, when she was 12 years old, Sacagawea and several other children were taken captive by a rival tribe in a violent raid. Torn away from her family and everything she knew, Sacagawea was forced into a world of uncertainty, with no way of knowing if she would ever see her family again. One can only imagine the sheer terror and heartbreak she must have felt at such a young age. In the year that followed her capture, she was won as a prize in a gambling match by a man named Toussaint Charbonneau. Toussaint, who was 33 when he met Sacagawea, was a French-Canadian fur trapper and guide who lived as a tradesman among the tribes in North Dakota. Although he was known to be a rough degenerate of a man, for Sacagawea, his company may have been a better fate than remaining a slave in captivity. Sometime in the coming years, they were married against her wishes. In May of 1804, Meriweather Lewis and William Clark began their expedition at the mouth of the Missouri River in St. Louis. They would follow the river to its source until the water began to flow west instead of east, and then they would follow that west-flowing river to the Pacific Ocean. It was expected that on their journey the group would be encountering many Native American tribes. Alongside the goal of mapping the land, they also had orders to inform those tribes that the land they lived on and had for thousands of years now belonged to the United States. To appease the Native American leaders, the expedition would offer gifts along with a peace medal. One side of the medal featured Thomas Jefferson's likeness, while the reverse depicted two hands joined in a handshake. And if this didn't go over well, they had a cannon ready on their boat. Luckily, the initial weeks of the journey went very smoothly. Many tribes not only took the news graciously, but also provided the expedition with their knowledge of the wilderness, one even allowing Lewis to wrap a baby boy in a United States flag and declare him an American. But as they got further into their journey, one tribe warned Lewis and Clark that not everyone on their way would be so friendly. The Lakota were the most powerful tribe in the Great Plains at the time, and also the most fearsome. They'd heard word that the white men were coming, and they didn't wait to be found. Instead, they surprised the expedition with 3 chiefs and 30 warriors ready for battle. tense, and without an interpreter, the situation escalated very quickly. Angered by the meager tribute of gifts the expedition party had brought, the Lakota began to try and intimidate Lewis into giving them all of their guns and a boat, something the party could simply not afford to do. When a group of their warriors began to pull on the boat's tow ropes, the usually mild-mannered Clark pulled out his sword and began to argue with one of the chiefs. Lewis ordered one of the men to load the cannon, and the Lakota warriors notched their arrows. The situation was only saved when one of the chiefs, named Black Buffalo, ordered his men to halt. He would allow the expedition to depart, but only if the group joined the Lakota at their camp for a few days first. Without much other choice, Clark agreed. For the next 3 agonizing, high-tension days, the expedition remained at the Lakota camp, as they showed off the scalps of their enemies and danced into the night, until they were finally allowed to depart, but not without parting gifts of whiskey and tobacco. At the end of the ordeal, it was clear that they needed an interpreter to avoid situations like that from ever happening again. As winter approached and mornings began to frost, Lewis and Clark decided it was time to winter near the friendly Mandan tribe, who allowed them to build a fort right across the river. There, they interviewed several men who might be able to interpret for them on the journey ahead. One of them claimed to speak several languages and also claimed that his wife spoke Shoshone. It was Toussaint Charbonneau and Sacagawea, who was now 16 and pregnant. They were hired and moved into the fort a week later. That winter, Lewis and Clark got to know the two of them in their own ways. Meriweather Lewis was a close friend of Thomas Jefferson, and he was a complex man. Intellectual, introspective, educated, and meticulous, yet prone to dark moods. In order to get to know his new guide and his wife, he observed Sacagawea in what she did around camp as part of his ethnographic report on Native people. Otherwise, he seemed to disappear for days on end into solitary reflection. William Clark, on the other hand, had been chosen by Lewis maybe because of just how polar opposite he was to him. Clark was steady and even-tempered. He seemed to handle not only the logistics of the expedition, but also the morale of the crew. He had a natural ease to him, and after getting to know her a little bit, he nicknamed Sacagawea Janie. When her baby boy, Jean-Baptiste, was born months later on February 11, 1805, Clark would affectionately nickname the baby boy Pompey. Over 6 months, they stayed at their fort, enduring as brutal a winter as many of them had ever seen. But the Mandan tribe, as curious about the white men as they were of them, crossed the frozen river often, graciously bringing the crew food and lumber. Inside by the fire, the two groups, who thought they couldn't be more different, really got to know each other. They spoke on what mattered to them. They laughed and even danced, slowly realizing that, of course, they weren't so different after all. By April 7, 1805, spring finally arrived at the camp, and with the party in the highest of spirits, it was time to get going again. With the help of the Mandan chiefs, they were told about the way ahead, which included a great waterfall, and what the chiefs called a shiny mountain range, which they expected were probably like the mountains in Virginia. Lewis anticipated that both would only cause a slight delay, maybe a couple days at most. Unfortunately, they would be very, very wrong. Along the way, they would discover not only the most breathtaking beauty, but also the dreadful enormity of their task. I can't imagine traveling this harrowing route without a doctor and being in danger of losing your medical supplies. Thank goodness it's not like that for us today. That's what today's sponsor, ZocDoc, is here to help with. There's nothing more disheartening for me than going through so many hours of searching and phone calls to find a doctor, getting there, and then having a bad experience. For me, the very worst thing is when they rush you through, and you can tell they don't care about your problem even though you just waited for hours. They just want to move on to the next patient. And you're sitting there thinking, I did all of that for this? I rearranged my whole day, I navigated the insurance maze, I finally showed up, and I don't feel heard or cared for? And that's what ZocDoc, today's video sponsor, helps with, finding someone who feels right for you. ZocDoc is a free-to-use website that has over 150,000 providers across 200 specialties. They do the heavy lifting of finding a doctor for you. Same-day appointment? I found it. 5-star verified reviews from real patients? Found them. Online booking with no phone calls, no hold music, and no back and forth? Done. In person or virtual, it's your call. From primary care to dermatology, eye care to urgent care, ZocDoc has nearly everything, and it is completely free to use. You deserve a doctor who listens, so stop putting off those doctor's appointments. Head to ZocDoc.com/royalty now, also linked in the description, to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. On one of the first days out, Sacagawea, who some of the men hadn't even acknowledged yet, would prove herself pivotal when choppy waters caused Charbonneau to lose control of his boat. On it were all of Lewis and Clark's journals, scientific books, and medicines, which had begun to wash overboard. While Toussaint just began to yell and panic, Sacagawea calmly set her baby down and was somehow able to rescue everything from the water without breaking a sweat. Lewis, not one to give a compliment easily, wrote later that Charbonneau was a man of no particular merit, but Sacagawea was as brave as any man on the expedition. By the end of May, the party had finally reached sight of the shiny mountains they had been told about, but it seemed no matter how fast they traveled on the river day after day, the mountains remained just as far away as when they first saw them. As they pressed into modern-day Montana, they began to see the landscapes around them change from lush landscapes to dry, unlivable desert. To the most beautiful river cliffs, nearly 200 feet tall, made of white sandstone, with enormous rocky peaks that almost looked like the ruins of an ancient great city. But the pinnacle of the journey was the sight they saw on the morning of June 13, 1805, when they finally reached the Great Falls of Missouri. Unfortunately, the falls were much larger than Lewis or Clark had expected, and soon they realized that the only way around them would be to haul their boats onto land and painstakingly drag them inch by inch. Instead of the day's delay they had initially planned for, the grueling way around the falls would take them almost an entire month, slowed by prickly pear cactuses tearing their shoes and clothing, a flash flood that nearly caused Clark, Sacagawea, and her son to drown, followed by the largest hailstorm any of them had ever seen that injured many men on the crew. Finally, they reached the other side of the falls and would celebrate so hard that they finished their entire store of whiskey. But for Captains Lewis and Clark, they couldn't get an image out of their heads. As they had slowly gotten closer and closer to the mountains that had once seemed permanently in the distance, they realized that even in the dog days of summer, the tops of those shiny mountains were covered with snow. If it was snowing up there even now, as they lay drenched in sweat, how cold would it be as winter approached? Only Sacagawea truly knew that if they didn't reach the mountains soon, they would never make it past them. As the realization began to truly hit the crew, the Missouri River split into 3 equal forks. With no way of knowing which one was correct, and without time to explore all 3 to make sure, Lewis confided in his journal that he now doubted the journey would even be a success. But just as everything seemed truly lost, Sacagawea recognized something far in the distance. A large rock had sparked something from her memories. This was her people's land. For the first time since she had been kidnapped as a child, she was home. Lewis left immediately, knowing that he needed to reach the Shoshone and negotiate horses as quickly as possible. On August 12, 1805, he found a well-worn Indian trail and followed it west, towards the rock that Sacagawea had recognized. It led him up a creek that wound up a large ridge. And just like that, he realized he had found it, the source of the Missouri River. Following the creek up the ridgeline, he felt an enormous sense of pride and joy. He'd imagined this moment for the last decade of his life. He was standing near the Continental Divide, On one side of this ridge, the rivers would flow west, and the expedition should just be able to float down to the Pacific Ocean. But as he reached the top, expecting an easy stream they could float down, he saw nothing but endless mountains. Prone to depression, Lewis felt the 300-year-old dream of a fabled Northwest Passage through the United States die. But because he had to, he carried on. On the morning of August 13, 1805, Lewis finally caught sight of 3 Shoshone women gathering food. Although he immediately dropped his gun, when the women saw him, they didn't run or fight. They simply sat down, holding their heads in their hands. The Shoshone people had been raided, killed, and kidnapped by nearly every tribe they had ever met, and they expected nothing but violence from Lewis and his men. They were surprised when he gave them gifts instead. Soon, their chief, named Meriweather, along with 60 other warriors, galloped up to the group. The chief dismounted, walked straight towards them, and gave Lewis the most affectionate hug he had probably ever received. Using sign language, Lewis was able to convey their urgent need for horses. But Lewis's request for a large number naturally raised Shoshone suspicions. Even though Meriweather and his tribe had been hurt so many times in the past, they still agreed to help. On August 17th, Lewis and Meriweather reunited with the rest of the party. Sacagawea was called over to translate, and she came and sat down. But when the 2 Native Americans met eyes, Sacagawea jumped up and tackled the Shoshone chief, Meriweather. The two began to weep uncontrollably. Meriweather was her brother. After years of anguish and heartache, Sacagawea was whole again. Sacagawea must have felt deep pride as she introduced her baby son to his powerful uncle. Any suspicions between the 2 groups were instantly dissolved when Sacagawea explained the situation to Lewis and Clark. They traded the necessary horses for knives and handkerchiefs, and the Shoshone even agreed to provide guides for the expedition over the Rocky Mountains. They would spend 2 weeks preparing, which gave Sacagawea enough time to tell her people the story of what had happened to her, and for them to tell her how hard it had been for them since she was taken. It must have been an extremely healing 2 weeks for both parties. By August 31st, it was time to part ways, but spirits were as high as ever. What they didn't realize was that the journey ahead of them would be the hardest of their lives. Although the weather was pleasant at first, the trail was not, and one of their first days in the mountains, they got lost and unknowingly trekked up and down the same mountainside over and over. Their hunters were struggling to find game, and when the snow came, it made everything exponentially worse. Everyone on the expedition had grown so hungry that they found themselves eating their candles. Yet as much as any man complained, no one had it as hard as Sacagawea. Not only did she have to survive the now brutal cold, the trek, and the hunger, she also had to breastfeed her son and keep him warm. What was only supposed to take a couple of days ended up taking 11. By the time they emerged, they felt more dead than alive, but everyone, including Sacagawea and her son Jean-Baptiste, were accounted for. Setting out on a river where the current finally favored them, they braved rapids so treacherous that locals watched from the banks, certain the party would drown. Yet they survived. By October 18th, the sight of Mount Hood signaled they were back in charted territory. The Pacific was now only 200 miles away. The landscapes around them would change to foggy forested mountains, and they began to see Native American tribes with wooden houses wearing European jackets that even spoke to them in English. The river began to widen and they began to smell sea air. They knew they were close. On November 19th, Clark arose early and set up a mountain not far from camp. As the foggy morning lifted, he saw sight of the Pacific Ocean. After such a harrowing journey, it's not hard to imagine that even the most steady and even-tempered man might have a tear or two in his eyes. In a nearby tree, he would carve a message: William Clark, November 19, 1805, by land from the United States. Even though he had just written his name on the tree, Clark knew that this had been earned by every single member of the expedition. When it came time to decide what to do for the winter, Lewis and Clark left it up to the crew, including Sacagawea. It would be 115 years before women would be allowed to vote in the United States of America. But she had a vote here, a vote that she had wholly earned. They would decide together to build their winter quarters just south of what is now Astoria, Oregon. They would spend the next 5 months there, trading with nearby tribes anytime they could. By March 1806, it was time to go home. And not long after that, it was time for Sacagawea, along with her husband Charbonneau and her little boy, Jean-Baptiste, to say goodbye to Lewis and Clark. Throughout the long, arduous months of the expedition, a profound bond had developed between William Clark and Sacagawea's young son, Jean-Baptiste. Before they left for good, Clark offered to take in Jean-Baptiste to raise and educate. Realizing how much more opportunity Clark could offer her son, Sacagawea sadly agreed. She promised to deliver her son to him in St. Louis the following year. On September 23, 1806, their journey had concluded. Lewis and Clark arrived in St. Louis to thunderous applause and citizens shooting rifles. One senator said it was as if they had just returned from the moon. Lewis would return victorious to his friend Thomas Jefferson and was rewarded with an appointment as the governor to the Louisiana Territory. But unfortunately, the years that followed would not be so kind to him. He would fail to marry, failed to finish writing a highly anticipated book on his experience, and fall deeply into debt. In 1809, he set out into the wilderness, as he had done so many times. But this time, he had no plans to come home. He died on October 11th, 1809. William Clark would get married, move to St. Louis, and become an ambassador to the Native American people. They came to call him the Red-Headed Chief. He also kept his word to Sacagawea and raised her son, Jean-Baptiste, who received the finest education. Jean-Baptiste was befriended by a German prince and even lived in Europe for 6 years, fathering a child there. He would return to the U.S. and live an equally adventurous life before dying at the age of 61. Sacagawea had a second child, a daughter, but is said to have fallen ill in the winter of 1812. According to her husband Charbonneau, she died on December 20th at the age of 24. There's no record of what happened to her daughter. Yet there is another story, an oral history amongst Native Americans, that states that Sacagawea left Charbonneau, returned to her people, and lived freely to the ripe old age of 96. We may never really know her fate, but what we do know is that today Sacagawea has become a symbol for women's strength. Kidnapped at a young age and forced to marry, she endured one of history's epic journeys, all while carrying her child on her back. Her fortitude would earn the respect of even the most hardened men, and earn her the right to be heard. A right that would finally be given to women 115 years later. So let's talk about what Sacagawea really looked like. She's one of the most depicted Native American women in history, and one of the most ubiquitous figures in our imagination of the American West. Yet, much to my chagrin, neither Lewis or Clark ever described her appearance in their journals. We have no single portrait of her made during her lifetime. So while this makes it hard to be accurate with recreations, I can use what we know of Shoshone hair and dress, along with photo references of their appearance to create an image. White authors in the 1900s loved to describe her with white features, one even giving her red hair and gray eyes. Eva Emery Dye wrote of Sacagawea, saying that she was the Madonna of her race and that her nose was fine and straight. Obviously, these descriptions are faulty, showing how 20th century white culture was eager to claim this courageous Native American woman as one of their own. In reality, the Shoshone were copper-skinned, strong-featured people. Based on what we know of her tribe, she probably had a broad face with high, strong cheekbones and a strong, sloping nose. These photographs depict the Shoshone around the late 1800s, and you can see that most, by this time, have adopted a Western style of clothing. The Shoshone of Sacagawea's time thrived in what could be a cold and brutal environment, so their clothing was usually a full deerskin tunic and pants. They usually traveled with a decorated blanket or shawl wrapped around themselves for warmth. Even braids were wrapped in fur. Clothing and belts would also be highly decorated with beads. In fact, we know Sacagawea had a beautifully beaded belt since Lewis and Clark note that she traded it along the expedition for a fur cloak. Her baby son may have been strapped to a cradle board on her back or simply wrapped to her with cloth and then covered in her warm blanket. Her clothing on the trail would of course be more practical, but I've chosen to show her with more decorative items that the Shoshone would wear, like shell earrings, a feather, and a beaded tunic with fringe. This statue in Bismarck, North Dakota, sculpted by Leonard Crunell, is rumored to have been sculpted based on a descendant of Sacagawea's. And the image we're all familiar with in the United States, the US dollar coin, used a Shoshone woman named Randiel Tuton as the model. So I'll use these combined with other Shoshone images to sculpt her face for my recreation. And since Lewis and Clark feature so prominently in the story, I thought it would also be fun to create some modern recreations of them. So let's see Sacagawea, Lewis, and Clark brought to life now. Thank you all so much for watching. Hit those like and subscribe buttons for us if you enjoyed this, and we'll see you for the next one.